So in this video, we're going to look in a little more depth on the peer review process. And peer review, first, is one of the things that's often said differentiates academic publishing from any other form of writing, in that your paper is going to be reviewed by often anonymous people who don't know you, reviewers, and they're going to have a tremendous influence on whether your paper will be published. And it is a sometimes nerve-wracking, controversial process. It's going through a number of changes now. So it's important that you understand at least the basic outlines of the peer review process. So the process goes through a number of stages depending on the status of your paper. Initially, you'll receive an email from the editor after you submit a paper telling you that the paper will be peer reviewed. And then eventually, at some point, depending on a number of often factors that the editor cannot control, you'll get back a letter either telling you one of normally four things. Your paper has been accepted. Your paper is accepted with minor revisions. It's been major revisions, or it's been rejected with major revisions, or the paper is simply rejected. And then you have to go about doing the revisions within the process of keeping it within the guidelines. So one thing I always have a problem with is my papers are very long. So frequently I have to cut the paper. In the last instance, I just told them, cut wherever you want. I learned that many years ago when I was taking classes in journalism, and I can apply the same standards. If you need to cut 1,000 words, then go ahead. I'll cut it as much as I can. It's very hard for me to cut my own work, so I like having if the editor wants to cut it, go right ahead. Then, in the end, there's a decision. Often the editor makes the decision, sometimes based on the peer reviews, but the decision belongs to the editor. And so the editor can use the peer reviews, or actually they could ignore the peer reviews. And sometimes the reviews can be contradictory, and the editor may have to make a decision based on the contradiction. And I'm sure there are other factors in terms of whether the editor likes the paper or how well it fits into the journal that go into this decision-making process. As an author, then you have to look very carefully at what the editor says. Sometimes the editor will highlight certain aspects of the review, and you may need to pay particular attention to those aspects that the editor points out. Generally, the editors feel that the reviewers are good people and that you're responsible to respond to them, but you don't need to respond to everything they say. You don't have to agree with everything they say. But it's sometimes very difficult to interpret exactly what the reviewers mean. And again, that's part of the negotiation process. It's not simply a question of saying, as one per se, you say jump and I say how high. It's a process of negotiation where you try to figure out what is it that the editors are really and the reviewers are really looking at. One of the aspects that's sometimes very difficult is that how does the review fit into the guidelines of the journal? Journals have often sometimes very specific things they're looking for. I was once editor of a journal that did not like, for example, surveys that talked about why students like something. They didn't feel that was very authentic. And sometimes these are stated specifically in the guidelines, and sometimes they're not stated. And particularly if they're not stated, you need, as an author, to have to figure that out as you look through the journal. What kinds of things are the journal publishing, and what kinds of topics the journal is not publishing. Then how do you respond to the reviews? So you go through each of the comments, and remember you're responsible for every comment that's made. Then you can revise your text based on those comments, and then you write a letter. Often you're required to do this along with your resubmission explaining what comments you responded to, how you responded to them, and again, if you didn't respond, where you disagree and why you disagree. And frequently, if you don't like a comment and you can come up with a reasonable reason why you disagree with it, the editor won't hold you responsible. And again, it's normally, sometimes they review the paper. The editor could send it to the same peer reviewer, or they can find different peer reviewers. And again, this is a kind of complicated process. But the editor is up, it's really in the end, it's going to be up to the editor to decide how well you responded to the comments of the peer reviewers. Again, there's a timeline. Often they do give you a deadline for doing this. So after you receive the review, again, review the comments both and then decide which ones you're going to reject and which ones you're going to revise, and then based on that you're going to resubmit it. You write a response to the comments. Sometimes you can just say you did it. Sometimes you may need a longer explanation. And this is often in the form of a letter, not necessarily formal level, but it's a letter. And so sometimes I frequently see people say, thank you very much for your comments. You know, you say something nice to the reviewer because you don't really know if the reviewer is going to see this again. Somebody may see it, the editor may see it, and is the reviewer going to see it? It's up to whether the reviewer, in some cases, asked to see it, said it's okay if they'll review again, but some reviewers don't really want to look at papers again, and partly it's up to the editor. In one case, I got a paper that I had rejected. Normally, you don't get back papers that you reject, but in this case, the editor sent me a paper. And I knew that I don't think the editor particularly agreed with my rejection. So that was sort of unsaid. I, as a reviewer, have gotten very little feedback on the reviews, whether the editor agrees with them or not. I guess if the editor doesn't like your reviews, you won't be asked to review again. And if they do like your reviews, you may be asked to review again. But I've gotten very little feedback on this whole process over many years I've been a reviewer. So now I have a month to review. A reviewer may have a little longer. And again, if it's too short a review, and we'll talk more about this in another video, that's not a good sign. So good reviewers, they're busy people, they're not getting paid, and so they're usually given a fair amount of time, but they're given deadlines, and more it's like a month, 2 months, and then the reviewer will resubmit the review. Usually, sometimes the reviewer will have to answer some questions. Sometimes they break the review. These are for the writer and the editor, and then the editor may allow for some private comments to the editor, where the reviewer can say something that maybe they don't want the author to hear or see. Revise your paper based on all of the comments. You may receive them in different ways. Sometimes they're done now a lot as in margins using Word. You may get a list of comments. Try to revise the paper as best you can. And again, if there are any disagreements between you and the peer reviewers, try to negotiate them. Don't be too nasty, don't be too angry, but try to say something. You can say, I can't do this, or it doesn't fit what I'm doing. So you can totally reject it, you can partially reject it, or you can accept it. It's up to you. But the key thing is to document all the changes you made to the paper so that you can send it in the letter back to the editor. What possible issues are there in your ability to revise? Sometimes you simply can't do it. I, for example, was asked one time to include dates. Sometimes it sounds like they're looking for a different paper. Again, I got a rejection by saying I didn't prove anything in my paper, but I didn't want to prove it. And that would have been a different paper, a whole different study to try to prove something. I was just looking at the time on implementing something. I know I had a really strong disagreement with an author who didn't like what I had said. I didn't like his paper. Of course, he was very angry about it, and kind of expressed anger. And sometimes the reviewer is wrong. I mean, they just don't know what you're referring to, or they may ask you, in one case I know, to cite a paper. I said, I don't think this paper is relevant. And the editor said, okay, fine. And they let it go. So it's up to the editor to somehow negotiate between you as an author and then the reviewers. What strategies can you use? Normally, not always, you can thank the reviewers and make sure that they understand what you're trying to do. Sometimes, I don't always do this, but sometimes the reviewer will try to make a short summary of what you did, and that's a way of demonstrating that they've read the paper and they kind of understand where you're going with it. So you can specifically rewrite. Sometimes you'll reorganize whole sections if you think the reviewer is not having trouble following what you're saying. It may be that you really need to reorganize it, even if the reviewer didn't specifically ask you to reorganize. A lot of times, one of the questions they say they're particularly concerned about is overstating results. And so one of the things that you may need to do is hedge assumptions that you made, hedge some of the results. It depends on how much data you have. And there are a number of ways of hedging, using reporting verbs, using modals, using adverbs that you can use. But try to be more on the cautious side in making claims, particularly when you don't have a whole lot of evidence to support them. And again, remember, you're not sure who the audience is. This is one of the biggest changes between publishing and grad school, where in grad school you know who's reading your paper. In publishing, you don't know who's reading your paper. Sometimes you may need to add additional research. And as I said, sometimes it sounds like they're asking for a whole different study. And this is one thing, if you really think, this is one of the things limitations do is tell people, okay, I know I considered this additional research, but it's not within the focus of the paper. It's going to make the paper too long. I used to tell students that if they can anticipate these limitations, that they can't be held accountable for them. I don't actually know anymore if that's true or not, but try as much as possible to try to anticipate what limitations, but you can add limitations. It's very hard for a reader to know when they see a published paper what it is that the reviewer had asked for and what it is that the writer had asked for. So again, future sections like limitations in future research are very good ways to include aspects of the comments that you simply cannot or do not want to respond to.